Hello and welcome to China Now. I am Makiza Latifa. It's a lovely Saturday. Hope you're having a good morning. Let's get straight into China currents, where innovation and industry are moving at full speed. Chinese scientists have delivered a world-first breakthrough in sodium-ion battery safety, pushing boundaries of next-generation energy technology. And Alibaba's Qwen AI model is making waves globally, shattering usage records and signaling the growing influence of China's AI system. In healthcare and neuroscience, China's Brain One brain-computer interface system has entered large-scale clinical trials, opening new frontiers in human-machine interaction. And in the energy sector, the Tianhan 7 gas turbine is making its mark on the international stage, breaking into the high-end offshore market. Plenty to unpack. Let's get started.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's China Currents. It's been a packed week in China for science and technology. Chinese scientists achieved a world first in sodium-ion battery safety. Alibaba's Qwen AI model shattered global usage records. China's brain-computer interface system, Now #1, entered large-scale clinical trials. The Tianhan 7 gas turbine broke into the international high-end offshore energy market. And yes, there was also a disappointment. The Tianlong 3 rocket failed on its maiden flight. Let's take them one by one. First up, a world first. Chinese scientists have built a sodium-ion battery with a built-in firefighter. On April the 6th, a team led by Professor Hu Yongsheng at the Chinese Academy of Sciences Institute of Physics published a landmark paper in the journal Nature Energy. They successfully developed a self-protective, polymerizable, non-flammable electrolyte, and for the first time anywhere in the world, demonstrated complete thermal runaway suppression in amp-hour scale sodium-ion batteries. What is thermal runaway? In simple terms, it's a chain reaction of uncontrolled heat release inside a battery under abnormal conditions, which can lead to fire or even explosion. It has long been the central safety challenge for the battery industry. The conventional wisdom was that using a flame-retardant electrolyte was enough to ensure safety. But Hu's team took a fundamentally different approach, proposing a 3-in-1 intelligent safety system that simultaneously addresses thermal stability, interface stability, and physical isolation. When the battery temperature rises abnormally above 150 degrees Celsius, the new electrolyte automatically solidifies from liquid into a dense barrier, essentially erecting a small firewall inside the battery that completely blocks the path of thermal runaway. What makes this even more impressive is that safety didn't come at the expense of performance. The battery operates across a wide temperature range from -40 to +60 degrees Celsius and withstands voltage above 4.3 volts. All the materials used are mature industrial products, giving this technology strong prospects for commercialization. Professor Hu has long been a leading figure in sodium-ion battery research and is also a founder of Haina Battery, a pioneer in the field. He has previously noted that sodium-ion batteries have a theoretical cost advantage of about 20% over lithium-ion batteries, and that the market could reach hundreds of billions of yuan within 3 to 5 years. With this safety breakthrough, the commercial deployment of sodium-ion batteries in electric vehicles, heavy trucks, and large-scale energy storage has taken a major step forward. From batteries to artificial intelligence, the biggest AI story of the week was undoubtedly the explosive debut of Alibaba's Qwen 3.6 Plus. On April 2nd, Alibaba released Qwen 3.6 Plus, the first model in its Qwen 3.6 series, positioning it as China's most capable coding model. How popular was it? On the evening of its launch on OpenRouter, the world's largest AI model API aggregation platform, usage surged 711%. Daily token consumption topped 1.4 trillion, rocketing to the top of the platform's daily leaderboard and shattering the all-time global record for single-day, single-model usage. OpenRouter officially called it the strongest new model launch ever. To put this in context, OpenRouter hosts leading AI models from around the world, including Cloud, GPT, Qwen, DeepSeek, and GLLM. The amount of tokens developers and businesses consume on each model reflects real-world performance, which is why the platform's leaderboard is widely regarded as the AI industry's live battlefield. The reasons behind Qwen's 3.6 Plus's popularity are clear. It natively supports a 1 million token context window, meaning it can process roughly 750,000 Chinese characters, or an entire code repository, in a single session. In coding benchmarks, its preview version ranked first in China on Arena's coding leaderboard. Most notably, it features agentic coding capabilities. The model can autonomously break down tasks, plan execution paths, and generate or fix code on its own. Developers around the world have been sharing stunning results, using a single natural language prompt to have Qwen generate fully functional websites, games, and mini programs from scratch. Over the past week, Alibaba actually released 3 major models in rapid succession: the Qwen 3.5 Omni, the text-to-image model 1 2.7 Image, and Qwen 3.6 Plus, covering multi-model understanding, visual generation, coding, and AI agents. The company's even stronger flagship model, Qwen 3.6 Max, is reportedly coming soon. Now, for the less cheerful news. On April the 3rd at 12:17 p.m., the Tianlong 3, a large liquid-fueled rocket independently developed by Chinese commercial space company Space Pioneer, experienced a flight anomaly during its maiden launch. The mission failed. The Tianlong 3 is China's large-capacity liquid rocket in the commercial space sector, often dubbed China's Falcon 9. Standing about 72 meters tall, with a liftoff mass of roughly 600 tons, it is powered by 9 TH-12 liquid oxygen kerosene engines on its first stage, delivering a low Earth orbit payload capacity of 17 to 22 tons, enough for 36 satellite deployment in a single launch. The flight had originally been scheduled for April the 2nd, but was delayed one day due to weather. Space Pioneer promptly issued a public statement apologizing to partners and the public and confirming that the company has launched a return to zero fault investigation, a rigorous failure analysis methodology developed by China's space program that requires tracing every anomaly to its root cause with zero ambiguity. This approach has since been widely adopted in the international aerospace community. In fact, several Chinese commercial rocket companies have encountered setbacks on maiden flights in recent years. In January this year, Galactic Energy's Series 2 experienced a flight anomaly on its debut. Late last year, Landspace Zhuque 3 failed its first stage recovery attempt. This pattern is not coincidental. China's commercial space industry has moved beyond the early phase of small rocket validation and entered a far more technically demanding era of heavy lift and reusable launch vehicles. With hundreds of thousands of components in high-level integration, even the smallest deviation can cascade into a system-level failure. As one commercial space investor put it, a new rocket typically needs 3 to 5 launches before reaching a relatively stable state. Looking at global aerospace history, SpaceX's Falcon 9 also failed multiple times during early testing. Commercial spaceflight requires room for trial and error. That is simply the nature of technological progress. Let's now turn to another frontier, brain-computer interfaces. Recently, Capital Medical University's Xuanwu Hospital completed the first implantation surgery under a multi-center GCP clinical trial for the Now Ep156 Intelligent Brain-Computer Interface System. GCP, short for Good Clinical Practice for Medical Devices, is the regulatory pathway that any medical device must pass through on its way to market approval. This means Now Ep156 has officially entered a new phase of standardized, large-scale confirmatory clinical trials, with an initial enrollment target of 36 patients. What exactly is Now Ep156? It is a semi-invasive, wireless, fully implantable brain-computer interface system jointly developed by the Beijing Institute for Brain Research and Beijing New Cyber Neural Tech. In plain terms, it involves a flexible electrode thinner than a cicada's wing and smaller than half a palm, surgically placed inside the skull on the surface of the dura mater. This electrode captures brain signals across 128 channels. Those signals are wirelessly transmitted and decoded by AI algorithms. translating the patient's intentions into control commands, enabling paralyzed patients to operate computers and robotic arms with their thoughts, or even stimulate their own muscles for rehabilitation. Since early this year, Now Ep156 has been implanted in multiple patients. One patient, paralyzed for nearly 5 years after a car accident, gradually regained the ability to walk with assistive devices after brain-computer rehabilitation training. A 67-year-old patient with ALS who had lost the ability to speak successfully achieved real-time Chinese language decoding through the system, the first time this has been accomplished anywhere in the world with a wireless, fully implanted brain-computer interface. Compared to Neuralink's subdura fully invasive approach, Now Ep1's semi-invasive design carries lower surgical infection risk, while its 128-channel signal capacity is among the highest in comparable international products. From electrodes and chips to algorithms and system integration, the entire technology chain is independently developed. This is not just a technical milestone, it is a critical step for China on the future industry track of brain-computer interfaces. Our final story comes from the energy sector. China Aero Engine Group's gas turbine subsidiary recently signed a deal with Hanchen Elite Marine Engineering in Nantong, Jiangsu Province. Under the agreement, Hanchen Elite will purchase 5 Taihang 7 gas turbines to serve as core power units for an FPSO, a floating production, storage, and offloading vessel being built for Malaysia's national oil company, Petronas. What is a FPSO? It's a large floating facility that integrates oil production, storage, and export operations, typically stationed in deep waters for years on end. The reliability demands on its power systems are extraordinarily high. Gas turbines serve as the heart of an FPSO, and for a long time, this market has been dominated by foreign manufacturers. The Taihang 7 is a 7-megawatt aero-derivative gas turbine independently developed by China, evolved from the renowned Taihang aircraft engine. It has been specially adapted for harsh marine conditions, high salt spray, high humidity, and high corrosion. In 2023, it was first commissioned on an offshore oil platform in the South China Sea, becoming the first domestically made gas turbine to operate on the Chinese offshore oil and gas platform. Its cumulative operating time has now exceeded 25,000 hours, proving its reliability in real-world conditions. The unit costs roughly 15% less than comparable imports, with significantly lower maintenance expenses thanks to domestically sourced components and service systems. This deal marks the first time a Chinese-made gas turbine has entered the high-end FPSO market, and for an international top-tier energy project, no less. Behind it lies years of accumulated expertise in indigenous core component manufacturing and marine anti-corrosion engineering. It is yet another example of Chinese manufacturing evolving from import substitution to serving the global market. That's all for this week's China Currents. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.
Now let's turn to the Thinkers Forum, where ideas take center stage. In this edition, we're joined by Daniel Benzner, historian, journalist, and assistant professor at the University of Washington. He brings a critical lens to the global affairs, unpacking the historical forces and policy decisions shaping today's international landscape. Stay with us for more details.
I think we are living through a moment of transition in U.S. history and international and global history. Since World War II, the United States has really been the predominant power. It controlled, I think it was 50% of world manufactured goods in 1945. It had a nuclear monopoly. It had really the only world's genuine Air Force. It was just an incredibly powerful nation, particularly because the so-called developed world, and some degree it's an accurate term, had committed suicide in World War II, whether you're looking at continental Europe, or even Japan as well. Then the United States became even more powerful with the collapse of the Soviet Union between 1989 and 1991. And frankly, the more we learn about the Soviet Union from archives, the more we see that it was to some degree a paper tiger, that it was never as powerful as Americans interpreted, that it was relatively weak economically, even if it had quite a large military. So, to some degree, for almost a century now, the United States has been incredibly powerful. But I think things are changing because, of course, things are changing in world and global history. That was a very unique situation. It was unique that it was the North Atlantic world, the so-called West, that dominated many areas of the globe during the era of colonialism. And it was unique that other great civilizations like China, to take a random example, was particularly weak for a certain amount that happened to coincide with the North Atlantic rise to world power. So we are, I think, now exiting that era. I think that the United States and its G7 allies have been in both relative and absolute decline for a long time because their overwhelming power was unique. It was historically unique, driven by a set of contingent circumstances. And as the United States is and its G7 allies have been in relative decline, China has essentially, over the course of two generations, modernized to an incredible degree, lifting millions upon millions of people out of poverty, spending a lot more on its military to shore up its own defensive and offensive capabilities, and just, doing what if one was a dead alien looking at the entirety of world history, one would have expected China to do. That it wasn't always going to be in the warring states period. It wasn't always going to be disentangled, that under the Communist Party, since Mao's victory in 1949, it has consolidated its hold on a large swath of territory and really developed. So it's not a surprise that China is challenging American power in its region, in East Asia. And to my mind, it is not a matter of if the United States will eventually leave the region, but when the United States will leave the region and how the United States would leave the region. As a humanist who thinks that all lives are ontologically and philosophically equal, I hope that the United States is able to recognize the writing on the wall and to leave the region in a measured and peaceful way that doesn't stoke a war. Now, this is naturally, and this where we get back to Japan. The United States has been really responsible for Japanese defense, South Korean defense, Republic of Korean defense for a very long time. These are, of course, artifacts of World War II. But there's going to be a power transition in East Asia. I mean, and one could also look to Asia more broadly. India is also now much more powerful than it was in the past several decades. I mean, China is, to my mind at least, more powerful than India, but India is, coming up in the world. So this, of course, raises questions for Japan, who would want to retain all of its sovereignty, for South Korea, which is bordering a nation that is still, I believe, technically at war with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. This raises questions for Australia and the Philippines and other American allies in the region. To my mind, again, I want to avoid war. I think these powers are going to have to learn to accommodate themselves to a new regional order, which to my mind looks like it's going to be with China sitting at the top of that regional order. Now, ideally, there would be no conflict, but I believe that China, like many powerful nations, is going to try to affirm what it perceives as its own interest in its region. I do think that Chinese power, Chinese regional hegemony, is going to be of a different character than American hegemony was in the Cold War and post-Cold War and unipolar moments. And that from where I'm sitting, I don't think that the CCP, the Communist Party, has any interest in trying to govern the world in a way that the United States, I think, genuinely wanted to govern the world, wanted to transform other countries in its image, wanted to push economic liberalization, wanted to push capitalism, wanted to push its own form of procedural liberal democracy onto the world. China doesn't seem to have that interest. So it's going to be a power in the region, a major power. I think the United States is going to leave the region. I do not think the United States will fight China in a serious way over Taiwan. I don't, because that has the potential to lead to World War III, let alone a nuclear World War III. And I think regional allies of the United States are going to have to accommodate themselves to a new reality. Perhaps the United States could help shore up the security of a country like Japan. That is something that, might be reasonable. People need to look into it. But I think that we're entering a world of spheres of influence in the sense that the United States is going to dominate certain world regions. China will dominate other world regions. It will fight with other powers. I wouldn't be surprised if China and India have various conflagrations in the coming decades. Europe will dominate parts, that is, Western and Central Europe will dominate Western and Central Europe, and Russia will probably dominate its western borders, what is we in the North Atlantic world refer to as Eastern Europe, as well as the Balkans and the Baltics. So I think that is the world we're entering, of a new geopolitical reality that hasn't really existed in a very long time, hundreds and hundreds of years, and really never, because the regions of the world were never this integrated. We're never in such contact with one another. So it's a genuinely new space that is going to, raise certain questions and hopefully open up new possibilities. I think that there's institutional inertia. I mean, these are long-standing allies of the United States, basically in everyone's living memory. There are moral obligations, there are financial obligations, there are other types of geopolitical obligations to a country like Japan or to a country like South Korea. There's also ideology. I think Americans believe that they have the right and duty to govern the world, and that they should push a particular form of capital H history and capital P progress. I think there's domestic politics. The Democratic Party in particular has been very fearful of looking weak on foreign policy ever since Harry S. Truman, quote unquote, lost China to the communists, to Mao and the Communist Party in 1949, even though, it's not really a loss, but that's how it was perceived in the United States. There's also fears about Chinese geostrategy and whether China will try to dominate regions that have historically been dominated by the North Atlantic world, and more specifically the United States. People here believe that China wants to do that. Again, I don't see that. I think that is mostly American policymakers reading their own universalist Protestant millenarian values onto other countries, much like I would argue was done with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So there are significant obstacles. One hopes that there are future generations of foreign policymakers and foreign policy elites who recognize the material reality and accommodate themselves to it. But that could take a while. And in international politics, there's always possibilities of miscalculation and mistake making. Famously, we've just avoided nuclear war. I mean, there are different measurements, but we definitely almost went to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis and during this sort of fiasco surrounding the Able Archer in the early 1980s, Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, October, and then Able Archer in 1983, I believe. So there is always a possibility of mistakes, and obviously a mistake in a nuclear context could be devastating. So one hopes for wisdom, one hopes for peace, and then there are also larger collective action problems, like the great powers need to get along to deal with things like climate, to deal with things like pandemics, to deal with things like inequality between countries and inequality within countries. So there are going to be different pressures pushing in different directions, and we don't necessarily know how things will turn out. Well, I think there's always difficulties and complications when countries rely on other countries for security guarantees, particularly when they are so far away just in terms of pure distance. For example, China's in East Asia. The United States is not. It's very difficult to project power that far. Nevertheless, one would understand why a South Korean or Japanese leader would be anxious about losing that security guarantee, particularly given China's pure size and its pure economic and increasingly military power. Nevertheless, I think it would the United States is not going to get dragged into a war for another country. I think that is very unlikely. Even now with the case with Iran, I think Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu convinced Donald Trump to attack Iran, but I don't think he was doing it for Israel, even though Israel clearly has a strategy. And to my mind, the American foreign policy elite doesn't really have a strategy vis-a-vis Iran, but it was in America's, or at least Trump's perceived interest to do so. I think he thought that they were going to overthrow the Ayatollah and insert or appoint a Delcy Rodriguez type figure like was done in Venezuela, but it wasn't done for Israel. I think it was done for American reasons. And I find it very difficult to imagine any American leader fighting a war with China over any other country's interests. I think you even see in the Trump administration's national security strategy a recognition that interactions with China are going to be primarily over economic competition and not military. And even if you look at the rare earth fiasco that occurred between China and Trump, I think the United States recognized relatively quickly that it was not going to be able to push China around like it might have been able to. And so Trump switched to Venezuela, Trump switched to Iran, kind of giving up this tariff war because China is just too powerful. I mean, it's whether you love the Communist Party or hate the Communist Party, it's just a pure material reality of geopolitics that China is just a powerful nation, and is going to be increasingly powerful. And it is taking the lead in crucial energy sectors that are going to define the 21st century. So it's just going to become more and more powerful. So, to my mind, it is unlikely that the United States is going to go to war with China over any other country's interests. I think that is very unlikely. I think, like, to my mind, ideally, what you would see is a more peaceful integration amongst countries in particular regions, right? Like, from a democratic small d perspective, I do believe that countries should have the ability to choose their own paths. Now, in actual history, greater powers are always going to exert influence over weaker powers. China is going to have a significant impact on Vietnam, Japan, South Korea, Thailand, Laos, etc. Just like the United States has historically been very impactful on Canada, Mexico, the entirety of the Western Hemisphere, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Now, from where I stand in the United States, I would prefer if the nations of Latin America were able to choose their own paths, just like I would prefer Japan or whatever is able to choose its own path. But that is unlikely to happen. And I think the big powers are going to some degree push around smaller powers. But you might see over generations a type of regional integration that would able to be the foundation for a more genuine international law that wasn't necessarily just a North Atlantic centered law forced upon the rest of the world. In an ideal world, the countries of East Asia or North America would be able to form genuine democratic political and economic blocs that would not be one power pushing around another, which would lead to greater forms of regional integration, which would lead to greater forms of international and eventually global integration, because fundamentally we're all human beings. And even though we come from different cultures and different spaces, in an ideal world, we would have some form of law restricting our behavior as nations in order to prevent wars. That type of world, which was the dream of American liberals in the middle of the 20th century, basically foundered on the shores of the actually existing American empire, which tried to force its own politics and ideas onto the rest of the world, or many areas of the world, if not the entire world, at the barrel of a gun. And I don't think that works. I mean, I think that the lesson of the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st is that sort of forced militaristic or regional integration or global policy just actually increases war. So I would hope that the countries of the world learn from this, at least over time, and setting the stage for more genuine regional, global, and then, sorry, regional, international, and then global integrations that could establish a true international law. You cannot impose, you cannot just claim that North Atlantic values are universal and just force them onto the rest of the world. Even if I am the ultimate pro-human rights, pro-liberalism guy, as an empirical matter, you cannot force other nations to adopt that perspective. So to that criticism, which is oftentimes the response is, well, what about human rights? It doesn't matter what I think about human rights. I think you have to look at the actual history of the 20th and 21st centuries. I might support human rights. I do support human rights. Women's rights in Afghanistan, for example. But you cannot force other cultures to abide by your North Atlantic values. They are North Atlantic values. You might want them to be universal. Maybe from a philosophical perspective, you could claim they're ontologically universal and that everyone has certain freedom and rights, but in actuality, they're linked to particular cultures and particular times and spaces, and you cannot force them. That is just the reality. And that, I think, is one of the great lessons of the post-World War II period down until today. So that's what I say into that. And again, to my mind, you're only going to get the type of world that liberals claim to want of human rights and equality, et cetera, if you allow, quote unquote, allow, because I don't think the United States is allowing, I think it's relative power in decline, but if you accept that other regions, other parts of the world are going to choose their own path, and that's actually the more likely way to get a genuine international law over time. I think that what the United States and its allies tried to do after World War II was to essentially skip stages of history, which was to argue that you could just universalize North Atlantic values, Enlightenment values, which one could argue, are they actually in practice? The United States has an incredibly large prison population. You could point to the Holocaust. You could point to Jim Crow and racism. But even putting that aside, let's say that it was a perfect society with all equality. It's still a historically contingent and culturally situated value system. And I think you need to deal with other worlds on an equal level. And I think the spheres of influence world is the first step on a road that will ideally end in a form of universal human governance. And if you actually read Hans Morgenthau, who I'm more sympathetic to in terms of his theory than John Mersheimer, I think Mersheimer's offensive realism, the way I put it, is profoundly unrealistic. He wants to sort of challenge China, which I just think is unrealistic. But Morgenthau, his ultimate goal was a form of world governance. And so what he was trying to do was articulate what he took to be not really eternal. I think that's a misunderstanding, but sort of basic laws of international relations as a means to get to that form of world governance. And so I at least normatively agree with the goal of world governance, even though Morgenthau and I might disagree about how you get there. But I have the benefit of having seen the last 75 plus years of actually existing US empire and US history and global history. And what I meant by that is, like, let's say, I would say from a philosophical perspective, Ukraine defending itself is just from the North Atlantic tradition of just war. I think it's jus ad bellum in Latin, maybe. It's like it was invaded, aggressively by a larger power. But the American empire supporting that just war almost immediately after leads to the support of an Israeli government, which I and many critics and many international organizations would argue committed, at the very least, ethnic cleansing in Gaza and at the worst, genocide in Gaza. And so I think those two situations of a just war and an unjust war, both supported by the United States, shows how these things exist in dialectical tension with one another, or at least in tension, if not dialectical. We might never achieve a transcendence there. But I just don't think that you can only fund the just. I just think historically that has not proven to be the case. For every South Korea, which you could argue is just defense, there's a South Vietnam. And so I think you have to be skeptical about any one nation having what is effectively unchecked power. I think that socialism and forms of collective action and planning are ultimately that are democratically determined better ways to govern any society than relying totally on the free market. I think markets can be tools. I think that the price mechanism could be something that is useful, but it's not the only way to order a society, just like the centering of consumer preferences, like much, my understanding, American jurisprudence does, or regulatory jurisprudence does, is again, maybe one way to think about regulation, but not the only way. And I think that unchecked capitalism has engendered oligarchy both within the United States and around the world. But I mean, I would argue, and you might not agree, I think capitalism has essentially won. I think that China has embraced a form of capitalism. It is a different form of capitalism than the United States is, but it is capitalism. I think Russia has. I think basically every country in the world, except maybe North Korea, but North Korea is so tied to China that to what degree is it really outside of the system? So I think that most of the world hasn't embraced a form of capitalism, and I'm not necessarily sure that that is the best to humanity. Maybe some of these countries are believe in a status form of history and they're passing through capitalism in order to get to a more humanistic communism. That remains to be decided or to be determined. But I think that that is generally a problem for humanity because I think capitalism is ultimately based around consumption. And I think consumption is based around extraction of raw materials that have been proven to gravely harm the climate. And I think without any genuine stopping or regulation of that consumptive drive, we as a species are not going to be in a good situation. It might come for Bangladesh first, but it's essentially coming for us all. So, and you see the tension within China itself as China has taken the lead on green tech. It's also building a ton of coal plants because it needs to develop. And it needs to develop because there are theories of economic modernization. It wants to compete in the world. It wants to consume like North Atlantic populations are. And I think that that might be a problem. But who am I in the North Atlantic to tell other areas of the world that they can't live a life like I live here? I think Americans are responsible for what it used to be. I haven't looked into this recently, but it was a quarter or a fifth of all world energy usage. So who are Americans to tell other people that they can't live that way? But I think that that is a big problem. And I mean, this is what Marx predicted that if capitalism did generally come to dominate the world, you might see something like the mutual ruin of the contending classes. And I think we might be in that era now, even though I hope that we are in a could take an alternative path without seeing some sort of gigantic collective action problem threatening us all. So I do think that socialism is a more humane way to live. Um, I do think that the best way to get there geopolitically is not to try to force other countries through military action to adopt your way of life. And I hope that we could take a different path than the one we as a species appear to be taking right now.
And continuing with the Thinkers Forum, we are joined by Professor Michael Ross of UCLA, a leading expert on energy politics and global resource governance. In this discussion, he examines the ongoing conflict involving Iran and its far-reaching consequences for global energy markets, as rising tensions trigger what analysts describe as one of the most severe energy disruptions in modern history. His insights shed light on how war, energy security, and geopolitics are increasingly intertwined in today's world.
I think one thing that the last week or so demonstrates is that he's very concerned about energy costs and the price of oil, and realized that this is going to hurt him quite a bit politically if the Strait of Hormuz stayed closed for much longer. So when we see him making these extreme threats about destroying Iranian civilization, sending them back to the Stone Age, that to me tells me that he's panicking and he really, really wants a settlement. And so he was willing to accept terms that were not especially favorable for the US. And that shows to me that he is eager to find some way to stop the conflict from reemerging. Iran, on the other hand, I think in some ways comes out stronger, even though they've borne very heavy costs. But it demonstrates to the world just how important the control is of the Strait of Hormuz, and that they will have even under extreme conditions still the ability to disrupt global markets and inflict pain on the United States. So I think it's a very unfavorable situation for the United States. There's no getting around this. Enormous amounts of money was spent on this war. The U.S. credibility as an international leader was already very low, much lower under Trump because of the tariffs and the erratic policies. But this makes things even worse. The United States, for a long time, really since the 1970s, but even before, gained much of its international influence from its role as the guarantor, the country that guaranteed to the world the free flow of energy, the free flow of oil through its global naval power, its influence in oil exporting countries going back to even before the Second World War, and its position in the petrodollar market. And this critical role in global energy supplies has really been sacrificed by the United States with these actions. Now, instead of a force for stability, it's understood that the US has become a force for instability in global energy supplies. And I think that's going to have a very long-term consequential effects for global energy markets. It's certainly going to have an effect. It's going to have an inflationary effect, both oil importers, because their costs will increase, but it's also going to have an inflationary effect on oil and gas exporters because they're going to have these windfalls and the government will want to spend it. And one of the consequences is that because new money is being injected into their domestic economies, that will also have an inflationary effect. So those countries are all going to face inflationary pressures, an economic drag. Really, the country that benefits the most, and I'm not just saying this because I'm speaking to a Chinese institution, by far the country that benefits the most is China, because China is the country that is the world's major supplier of renewable technology, and demand for its products is going to increase significantly. And at the same time, it has reduced its oil and gas imports enough that the harm done from the higher prices will be not so great relative to the rest of the economy. I think that's how I see the biggest impact. Now, there could be other disruptions. The United States, the US dollar is, of course, the default currency in global markets, the so-called petrodollar market. Oil is priced in dollars. This might be disrupted. It's hard to see how that will play out. In the long run, I think this would mostly harm the United States and increase borrowing costs and lead to a kind of a longer term economic slowdown. It's going to have a big impact. It's a little hard to foresee how. Of course, Israel is a very big winner here militarily. They have achieved objectives that at least some Israeli leaders have wanted for a long time, the right-wing leaders. But the war has been very popular in Israel across the political spectrum, not just because of the destruction of Iran, which had been funding Hezbollah and Hamas and had this long-term anti-Israel strategy, but also because of its gains in Lebanon and the sort of free hand it has at the moment to attack Hezbollah bases and Hezbollah areas of support in much of the country. So Israel emerges as the great power. Israel also gains, I think, from a deepening alliance with the Sunni countries in the Gulf region. So that is Iran's adversaries, Saudi Arabia particularly, but also the other smaller Gulf GCC states. I think it's well known, even though people sometimes don't articulate it. Saudi Arabia had been encouraging the US and I think implicitly Israel to attack Iran. And there's been growing cooperation between Israel and these Sunni states. And I think this will only enhance that cooperation. And this again is going to be, it will be beneficial for Israel. The other Gulf states are going to, they're going to take a big hit. In the long run, even after they rebuild their facilities, their export facilities, their production facilities, their markets are going to weaken because countries realize that Iran will always have this possibility to cut off their supplies from the region. And now some of these countries have been trying to pivot toward renewable energy, but that's still they still have a very long way to go, and they're going to find it very hard to diversify. It's a good question. So much is changing right now. I haven't even mentioned Russia. Russia is another big winner. it's in that second category that I mentioned, oil exporters that are um, benefiting from a big increase in global demand for their product. I don't see, for example, the International Energy Agency, this organization that was founded in the wake of the 1970s oil shocks by the Western countries. I don't see it playing a larger role. There are other organizations that affect the flow of oil. OPEC, for example, OPEC has, to a large degree, really been a creature run by Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is the country that makes OPEC function and enforces changes in the rules, decides what how much the countries will be exporting. Saudi Arabia will be weakened and OPEC will be weakened. Russia, I think, will probably be strengthened as a global oil supplier. China will certainly be strengthened. But I don't really see any new organizations, any new institutions that will promote cooperation on energy in the future. What I see is the US giving away its leadership, destroying its credibility as an important source of stability, and nobody really at the moment stepping in. We'll see what happens with the Chinese government. We'll see what Russia tries to do. But for the foreseeable future, I just see a kind of disarray, and I think it'll take a long time to achieve some stability. I think it depends a little bit on what happens with Chinese diplomacy, decisions made by Xi Jinping. But if China acts as a for stability and the kind of peaceful trade in renewable energy technology, if China continues to facilitate the trade in critical minerals, if China continues to be an important force in mining around the world, and a growing force in mining around the world, if China continues to emphasize technology transfers and cooperation, I think China will have the opportunity to step into the gap left by the United States. And more countries are going to understand that the US is not a reliable supplier, a reliable partner. President Trump has done everything he can to destroy the US credibility as a reliable partner. Trump has made enemies out of the countries that traditionally have been US friends. So I think that this does create new opportunities for China and will especially increase willingness to cooperate with Chinese companies, to look to China for technical assistance in managing its energy needs, in turning to Chinese brands for their EVs and batteries. Russia doesn't have anything close to this in terms of its diplomatic power, its ability to offer cooperation and technical assistance. Really, they just have this massive supply of natural resources that they can offer the world. But they don't seem to have any interest in capitalizing on this opening created by the withdrawal of the United States. Well, here's the big question, I think. So right now, the world faces, with the climate crisis, two different problems, and has two different enormous tasks ahead. One is to build lots and lots of renewable energy, and the other is to reduce the consumption of fossil fuels. There's certainly going to be more progress on the first because of this shock. And the country that's the biggest supplier of renewable technology, China, is going to benefit. It's going to help countries accelerate. leaders around the world will on their own be turning to renewable energy to expand their grids. But the big question is, will this lead to a reduction in the demand for fossil fuels? And this is very hard to say because the as I said a moment ago, the countries that right now are outside the Gulf and supplying oil are also going to benefit from this shock. And the companies that help run international oil markets, the big Exxon and BP and Shell and Eni and so forth, these companies are also going to get big windfalls and are also going to continue to be highly influential. And in the coming months, new decisions will be made about investments um, in energy supplies, in oil and gas supplies. And I'll be watching very closely to see what those look like. Will financiers, will companies be making big longer term investments in producing oil and gas, or is the money going to shift away from oil and gas and towards other needs? That's the big question for me. And it's the simple answer to your question, but the wrong answer is that the world will move toward renewables and away from fossil fuels. That's the simple answer, but it's not right. The world will move toward renewable energy, but it's not clear that it's going to move away from fossil fuels. And to address the climate challenge, the world will have to reduce demand for fossil fuels dramatically. And I don't know yet if this is going to accelerate, if this development is going to lead to a drop in demand for fossil fuels or simply a continued demand more or less at the same rate. A big factor is, of course, the dramatic scaling up of data centers and the demands from the technology industry for new power. And this is a sudden and far-reaching demand for new energy. And if that energy is going to be met by fossil fuels or renewables, we don't know yet. So it's certainly possible that there will be more fighting and more bombs dropped. But the question, so political scientists like to say that conflicts end when there is what they call a herding stalemate. That is, a stalemate, neither side is gaining a new advantage, but both sides are hurting. They are suffering from the status quo, and they don't see advantages in the future. I think this conflict had entered a phase of a herding stalemate. That is, Iran was certainly hurting from this massive destruction of its infrastructure, but the United States and the Trump administration was also hurting from the ongoing conflict. As long as each retains the capacity to inflict pain on the other, they will want to stay out of further conflict. So my prediction is that there may be some fighting, there may be some bombing. Trump likes to, use the military whenever he thinks he can gain some advantage. Iran may not even have full central control over all of its military forces, and so there might be continued drones and missiles sent abroad. But it's going to be at a much lower level, and I think the two countries are going to be moving towards some kind of settlement. I think, by and large, the war is drawing to a close. And even if there's some further fighting, it is mostly going to be over because each side has found a way to inflict a lot of pain on the other, and neither side is going to gain much from further fighting. One further prediction. After the 1970s, there were these big oil shocks that led to large revenue windfalls in oil exporting countries, principally in the Middle East, but also parts of Africa and Latin America. And the people of those countries often believed that this would lead to an acceleration in their well-being. This was an opportunity to kind of jump ahead in development and benefit their societies in a major way. It turned out that often the opposite happened. Often countries were worse off. Often they got more corruption. They suffered from conflict. They suffered from poor governance. The money was not well spent. So the challenge they'll face is whether they can do better this time. And I'll be watching closely to see if they find better ways to use this one-time opportunity to help their longer-term future.
And that's where we leave it for today. I hope you enjoyed the show. Remember to send in your comments, your thoughts, your feedback, and suggestions through the email provided below. Remember that the stories may move fast, but the forces behind them run deep, and we'll keep tracking them right here on China Now. I am Makiza Latifa. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you same time next week. Let China not be far away from you anymore.